What is the Copernican view of the universe?
The Copernican view of the universe, proposed in 1507, argued that Earth was only one of several galactic bodies that orbit the Sun. This theory, put forth by Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, Mikołaj Kopernik, 1473 to 1543, was controversial in its day because it ran counter to the astronomical beliefs that had held sway for some 1,400 years, those of the Ptolemaic system, which maintained that Earth is the center of the universe and that the Sun and the planets all revolve around it. Copernicus devised his scheme out of necessity. Really, he had found that using the Ptolemaic system to predict the positions of the planets over long periods of time yielded haphazard results. Once he made the assumption that the Sun, rather than Earth, is the center of the solar system and that all the planets orbit the Sun, Copernicus realized that tables of planetary positions could be calculated much more easily and accurately. However, Copernicus was not the first to put forth such a radical idea. The Greek astronomer Aristarchus of Samos, c. 310 to 230 BC, was the first to maintain that Earth rotates on an axis and revolves around the Sun. But it was Ptolemy's ideas that took hold, not Aristarchus's. Copernicus did, however, take the argument a step further, averring that Earth itself is small and unimportant compared with the rest of the universe. But the Copernican view had its problems, too. Copernicus assumed that the planetary orbits were perfectly circular. Because of this error, he found it necessary to use some of Ptolemy's cumbersome epicecles. Smaller orbits centered on the larger ones. To reduce the discrepancy between his predicted orbits and those that he observed. It was not until the early 1600s that the elliptical orbit of the planets was put forth by German astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630.
What were the Salem witch trials?
A series of trials in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, the proceedings against 200 people accused of witchcraft became allegory for searching out or harassing anyone who holds unpopular views. Indeed, the 19 hangings that resulted from the witch hunt provide students of history with a cautionary tale about the hazards of mass hysteria. In the 17th century, people widely believed in witchcraft and that those who wielded its supernatural power could perform acts of ill will against their neighbors. Courts somewhat regularly heard cases involving the malice of witches. Before the notorious trials of 1692, the records of colonial Massachusetts and Connecticut show that 70 witch cases had been tried, and 18 of the accused were convicted. But nothing had reached the scale of the 1692 witch hunt. In January of that year, the daughter and niece of a Reverend Samuel Parris began exhibiting strange behavior. Upon examination by a doctor, the conclusion was that the young girls, ages 9 and 11, were bewitched. Compelled to name those who had bewitched them, the girls named a Carib Indian slave who worked in the minister's home, and 2 other women, one a derelict and the other an outcast. They were arrested. Hearings were held and others were accused, including upstanding members of the community whose only crime seemed to be their opposition to Reverend Paris. Members of his congregation became corroborative witnesses. By May, jails in Salem and Boston were filled with suspected witches awaiting trial. The court, now with a docket of some 70 cases, convened on June 28. Through the summer months and into September, 50 of the accused confessed to practicing witchcraft, 26 were convicted, and 19 were executed. The colonial governor of Massachusetts became alarmed by the number of convictions. He ordered the Salem court to disband and commenced hearings of the remaining cases in a superior court. Of 50 still accused, the court indicted only 23. Of these, there were only 3 convictions, all of which were overturned. In 1693 the colonial governor pardoned those whose cases were still pending and declared that witchcraft was no longer an actionable offense.
What was the Peasants' War?
Fought in 1524 and 1525, the war was in part a religious one that came during the Reformation. It was the greatest mass uprising in German history. In 1517 the Ger man monk Martin Luther, 1483–1546, had begun questioning the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. He soon had followers, nobles and peasants alike, and his reform movement spread, giving birth to Protestantism. The Christian beliefs practiced by those who protested against the Catholic Church. While many Protestants were sincere in their faith, some had their own motives for following the movement. German peasants looked to the Reformation to end their oppression at the hands of the noble lords. When the peasants revolted at the end of 1524, they were forcibly suppressed. Some 100,000 peasants died prior to the uprising. They had aimed to get Martin Luther's endorsement, but he declined to give it.
What were the results of the Reformation?
The emergence of the Protestants, who got their name for protesting against the Catholic Church, was officially recognized by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, 1500–1558, with the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, which granted the people the right to worship as Lutherans, the church named for reformer Martin Luther, 1483–1546. But the hostility between Catholic and Protestant countries erupted in 1618 with the 30 Years' War. That series of conflicts, which had become increasingly political as it raged, was ended with the Peace of Westphalia, which, among other things, stipulated that Lutheranism and Calvinism or Presbyterianism, founded by Frenchman John Calvin 1509-64, be given the same due as Catholicism. Through acts of state, both Catholicism and Protestantism took hold in Europe. With the northern countries, including those of Scandinavia, turning toward the new churches and the southern countries remaining Catholic. For the most part, the Reformation fostered an attitude of religious tolerance among Christians. However, conflict would continue, to the present day, in the British Isles, after Queen Elizabeth I. 1533–1603, adopted a moderate form of Protestantism, called Anglicanism. As the official religion of England, English Protestants colonized Ulster, northern Ireland, and in so doing gave rise to hostilities with their Irish Catholic countrymen to the south. For its part, the Catholic Church, too, underwent a period of reform, called the Counter-Reformation, which rid the Church of many of its pre-Reformation problems to emerge as a stronger religious body. The Reformation had without question brought about greater religious freedom than had been known before. Among the churches that emerged during the Reformation are the Lutheran, the Anabaptist, ancestors to the Amish and Mennonite churches, the Presbyterian, the Episcopal, and the Congregational and Unitarian, formerly Puritan, all of which have strong followings today. Both in Europe and in North America, where they were established by the colonists.
What was Love Canal?
When Love Canal, a community east of Niagara Falls, New York, made international headlines in August 1978, it was only after the neighborhood had already been the subject of local newspaper stories since 1976. And sadly, more headlines followed. Into 1980. What had become clear during these years was that Love Canal was toxic. Community residents had experienced unusually high incidences of cancer, miscarriages, birth defects, and other illnesses. There were also reports that foul odors, oozing sludge, and multicolored pools of substances were emerging from the ground. And children and animals returned from outdoor play with rashes and burns on their skin. Unbeknownst to the residents, all of these problems were attributable to the history of the site upon which their community had been built. Beginning in 1947, the Hooker Electrochemical Company had used Love Canal, with its clay walls, to dump 21,800 tons of chemical waste. In 1953, the company sold the canal to the Niagara School Board for the sum of $1. The deed acknowledged the buried chemicals, although it did not disclose their type or toxicity. A disclaimer protected the firm from future liability. The canal pit was subsequently sealed with a clay cap designed to prevent rainwater from disturbing the chemicals. Grass was planted. Soon Love Canal had become a 15-acre field. The following year, a school was under construction on the site. In 1955, 400 elementary school children began attending classes there and playing on the surrounding fields. Development happened fast. Roads, sewers, and utility lines crisscrossed the site, disrupting the soil. While residents began to discern problems as early as 1958, when they complained of nauseating smells and incidences of skin problems. It was not until the mid-1970s that the extent of the hazard became evident. It was then that unusually heavy rainfalls caused chemicals to surface. A portion of the schoolyard collapsed. Strange substances seeped into basements, and trees and gardens died. In October 1976, the Niagara Gazette began investigating these problems. But an official investigation did not begin until the following April. By this time, the site was a disaster. Toxins were found in storm sewers and basements. Exposed chemical drums leaked substances, and air tests detected dangerously high chemical levels in homes. Further testing identified more than 200 different compounds at the site, including 12 carcinogens, cancer-causing agents, and 14 compounds that can affect the brain and central nervous system. The residents of Love Canal organized, forming citizen groups including the Love Canal Homeowners Association. These groups succeeded in getting media coverage and in pressuring public officials to act. Finally, on August 2, 1978, the New York State Health Commissioner declared Love Canal unsafe. 6 days later, President Jimmy Carter, 1924, approved emergency assistance, and New York Governor Hugh Carey announced that funds would be used to purchase homes nearest the canal. While more than 200 families that were perceived to be in danger were moved. In 1980, problems resurfaced when researchers found that blood tests of residents showed abnormally high chromosome damage. The state recommended that pregnant women and infants be removed from homes, even those that had been certified as safe. In May 1980, conflict ensued between 300 Love Canal homeowners and officials from the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. On May 21, President Carter declared a second emergency at Love Canal. This time the actions were more comprehensive. Almost 800 families were evacuated, and their homes were either destroyed or declared unsafe until further cleanup could be done. 4 years later, a new clay cap was installed over the canal. It was also in 1984 that Occidental Petroleum, parent company of the firm that had dumped chemicals in Love Canal, reached a $20 million settlement with residents.
What were the effects of the Industrial Revolution?
The dawn of the Industrial Revolution spelled the end of home or workshop-based production. Factories were built to house the new machines, causing a population shift from rural to developing urban areas by the mid-1800s, as people went where the work was. Factory owners turned to child labor, and in the United States, to the steady influx of immigrants to run the machinery in their plants. As industry grew, it required financial institutions that could provide money for expansion. thus giving birth to a new breed of wealthy business leaders, including the extraordinarily prosperous robber barons. The industrial and financial tycoons of the late 19th century. But as industry evolved, government and policy changes did not keep pace. Serious social, political, and economic problems resulted, including poor and often dangerous working conditions, exploitation of workers, including child laborers, overcrowded housing, pollution, corruption, industry monopolies, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. Change was slow to come, but social activism and government reforms in the late 1800s and during the progressive era of the early 1900s, much of which centered around trade unions, alleviated these problems. The rapid development of industry caused sweeping social changes. The Western world, which had long been agriculturally based, became an industrial society where goods and services are the primary focus.
Who was Dante's Beatrice?
In Dante's masterpiece The Divine Comedy, the central figure is led to redemption by a character named Beatrice. His earlier guide through hell and purgatory was the great Roman poet Virgil. Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, was born in Florence, Italy, where he also spent much of his life. In 1274, at the age of 9, he was introduced to Beatrice Portinari. They met again 9 years later, and Dante was profoundly affected by her beauty and grace. When she died in 1290, Dante was inspired to commemorate her in several works. Most notably the Divine Comedy, c. 1308–1321. Beatrice is also depicted in Dante's The New Life, c. 1293, a collection of 31 love poems. He wrote The Banquet, c. 1304–1307, another collection of lyrical poems, to commemorate Beatrice's death.
What was the worst industrial accident?
It was the gas leak at a Union Carbide chemical plant in Bhopal, India, on December 3, 1984. At about 12:30 a.m., methyl isocyanate, MIC, a deadly gas, began escaping from the pesticide plant. And it spread southward, eventually covering approximately 15 square miles. Within a few hours, thousands of Bhopal residents were affected by the asphyxiating gas. General symptoms included severe chest congestion, vomiting, paralysis, sore throat, chills, coma, fever, swelling of legs, impaired vision, and palpitations. Estimates of the total death toll range from the official government estimate between 3,000 and 10,000. A figure based on what medical professionals described. In total, 200,000 people were directly or indirectly affected by the poisonous gas. Within hours of the accident, Bhopal police moved into action. closing the plant and arresting its manager and 4 of his assistants. The 5 men were charged with culpable homicide through negligence. Union Carbide dispatched a team of technical experts from its Danbury, Connecticut headquarters, but upon arrival at the plant, they were turned away by local authorities. Meanwhile, the Indian Central Bureau of Investigation seized the plant's records and logbooks and ordered an inquiry into the accident. Union Carbide's chief executive officer Warren M. Anderson flew to Bhopal, but he was promptly arrested, along with 2 officials of the company's Indian subsidiary. The corporate executives were charged with 7 offenses including criminal conspiracy, culpable homicide not amounting to murder, making the atmosphere noxious to health, and causing death by negligence. Anderson was later released on bond. Upon learning of the horrific accident, U.S. President Ronald Reagan, 1911 to 2004, sent a message conveying the grief shared by him and the American people. Multinational corporations, including Union Carbide, were vilified in the press. The Soviet news agency accused such companies of marketing low-quality products and outdated technology to developing countries. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, 1944 to 1991, of India visited the disaster site and announced immediate creation of a $4 million relief fund for victims. He also vowed that he would prevent multinational corporations from setting up dangerous factories in India. The implications of the industrial accident were many. It prompted public scrutiny of safety systems at chemical plants around the globe. Given the number of plants where poisonous chemicals are produced and stored, some observers believe chemical accidents could happen as often as once in every 10 years. Union Carbide, of course, suffered financially. The stock dropped more than 12 points, wiping out 27%, or almost $1 billion, of its market value, in about 1 week. Damage claims were filed in behalf of the victims, with noted American criminal attorney Melvin Belli filing one of them in the amount of $15 billion. In addition to the thousands who died in Bhopal, others suffered from long-term effects including chronic lesions of the eyes, permanent scarring of the lungs, and injuries to the liver, brain, heart, kidneys, and the immune system. In the years after the accident, studies showed that the rate of spontaneous abortions and infant deaths in Bhopal were 3 to 4 times the regional rate.
What was the Great Famine?
Typically the term refers to the Great Irish Famine, which began in 1845. That year crops failed across Europe, resulting in widespread hunger and disease, claiming 2.5 million lives. The famine was especially severe in Ireland, where many peasants exported their grain and millet and depended on potatoes for their own sustenance. The failure of the potato crop in 1845 was the 20th in Ireland since 1727. And it marked the beginning of the Great Famine, which lasted into 1848 due to more disastrous crop failures each successive year. The crops had failed due to blight, previously unknown to Ireland, which was caused by a microscopic organism. Fungus, believed to have been introduced by a ship from North America. British charity and government relief did little to alleviate the suffering. The resulting famine was responsible for a drastic decline in the Irish population due both to death and emigration. Between 700,000 and 1 million people died in Ireland, and nearly 2 million people left the country in search of a better life elsewhere. Other severe, or great, famines include one in 1769 in Bengal. The disaster claimed the lives of 10 million Asian Indians, one-third of the population. In 1878 up to 20 million Chinese people died as a 2-year drought held Asia in its grips, causing widespread crop failures. It is still considered the worst famine in history.
Why is the court-martial of Billy Mitchell famous?
The 1925 military trial of William Billy Mitchell, 1879 to 1936, made headlines because of the defendant's open and controversial criticism of the U.S. military. A U.S. general in World War I, 1914-18, Mitchell returned from the experience convinced that the future military strength of the country depended on air power. In fact, he had commanded the American Expeditionary Air Force during the war in Europe and had even proposed to General John Pershing that troops be dropped by parachute behind German lines. Pershing dismissed the idea. The war over, in 1921 Mitchell declared that the first battles of any future war will be air battles. But when the Navy and War Departments failed to develop an air service, Mitchell was outspoken about it, charging the military with incompetence, criminal negligence, and describing the administration as treasonable. Those were fighting words. Charged with insubordination and conduct of a nature to bring discredit upon the military service. Mitchell's trial began on October 28, 1925. After lengthy hearings, on December 17 of that year Mitchell was found guilty and was suspended without pay from the military for a period of 5 years. Congress entered the fray, proposing a joint resolution to restore Mitchell's rank. But President Calvin Coolidge, 1872-1933, upheld the court's decision. Mitchell responded by resigning. He returned to civilian life but continued to write and speak about his belief in an air force. He died in 1936, about 5 years too soon to see his predictions come true. In surprise air raids on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked U.S. military installations in the Philippines and Hawaii, though the U.S. military rose to the occasion. Entering World War II and building an impressive and mighty air fleet, many observers felt the military could have been better prepared to stage that monumental effort had Mitchell's advice been heeded years earlier.
What was the London Protocol?
The 1830 decree recognized an independent Greek nation. After the 8-year Greek War for Independence, 1821–29. The London Protocol officially ended Ottoman Turk rule of Greece, which had begun almost 400 years earlier. In 1453 the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey, and they soon moved westward to bring the Greek peninsula under their control as well. By 1456 most of Greece had been absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of years later, in 1770, the Greeks tried to overthrow the Turks and were aided in this effort by Russian Tsarina Catherine the Great, 1729–1796. Whose aim it was to replace Muslim rule with Orthodox Christian rule throughout the Near East. But the effort was unsuccessful. And it was 50 years before the Greeks would rise again to assert their independence. On March 25, 1821, the Greeks, led by the Archbishop of Patras, proclaimed a war of independence against the Turks. Soon, Egypt had thrown its military support behind the Turks. But even the combined force could neither defeat the Greeks nor squelch the revolution. In 1827 Britain, France, and Russia, all sympathetic to the Greek cause, came to their aid. In October of that year a combined fleet of the three European powers defeated the Turk and Egyptian fleet in the Battle of Navarino, off the Peloponnese Peninsula. But the deciding moment came when Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire in 1828. And the Ottoman Turks turned their attention to fighting the Russians. The following year, the Egyptians withdrew from Greece. In March 1830 the London Protocol was signed by Britain, France, and Russia, recognizing an independent Greece. Weary from the fighting, the Ottoman Turks accepted the terms of the proclamation later that year.
Who was Adam Smith?
Scottish economist Adam Smith, 1723–1790, is popular with conservative economists today. Because of his work titled The Wealth of Nations, written in 1776. Which proposes a system of natural liberty in trade and commerce, in other words, a free market economy. Smith, who was teaching at the University of Glasgow at the time, wrote, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer." The Wealth of Nations established the classical school of political economy but has been faulted for showing no awareness of the developing industrial revolution. While Smith advocated both free market competition and limited government intervention, He also viewed unemployment as a necessary evil to keep costs and therefore prices in check.
What are the characteristics of medieval times?
Although the Middle Ages were shadowed by poverty, ignorance, economic chaos, bad government, and the plague, it was also a period of cultural and artistic achievement. For example, the university originated in medieval Europe. The first university was established in 1158 in Bologna, Italy. The period was marked by the belief, based on the Christian faith, that the universe is an ordered world, ruled by an infinite and all-knowing God. This belief persisted even through the turmoil of wars and social upheavals. And it is evident in the soaring Gothic architecture, such as the Cathedral of Chartres. France, the poetry of Dante Alighieri, 1265–1321, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225–1274, the Gregorian chant, and the music of such composers as Guillaume de Machaut, c. 1300–1377.
How was the United Nations formed?
Officially, the United Nations, UN, was not formed until October 1945. However, events during World War II, 1939–45, had paved the way for the founding of the International peacekeeping organization that today is so familiar to people around the globe. Fervent German nationalist Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, and his troops invaded Poland in 1939. And soon Nazi Germany had conquered much of Europe. Leaders of 9 nations: Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, and Yugoslavia met with Britain and its Commonwealth states in London. There, on June 12, 1941, the countries signed the Inter-Allied Declaration, vowing to work together for a free world. 2 months later, on August 14, U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882–1945, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, 1874–1965, signed the Atlantic Charter. In it the two leaders outlined their aims for peace. On January 1, 1942, the declaration by the United Nations was signed by 26 countries who pledged to work together to fight the Axis powers: Germany, Italy, and Japan, and they agreed not to make peace separately. The term United Nations, otherwise known as the UN, is believed to have originated with Roosevelt. In late November and early December 1943, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, met in Tehran, Iran, for the first time during the war. There these Allied nations leaders cited the responsibility of a United Nations organization in keeping the peace once the war was over. though ending the war was first and foremost in the minds of these leaders. All had seen 2 world wars fought in close succession and were determined that the nations of the world could work together to prevent such an event from happening again. In August 1944, at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., representatives of Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China met to make plans for the peacekeeping organization that had been envisioned. The outcome of that meeting, which lasted into October, was the basic concept for the UN Security Council as we know it, with the world's 5 major powers having permanent seats on the council and a limited and rotating membership beyond that. When the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference, in the Soviet Union, in February 1945, they discussed matters that were central to ending the fighting with Germany and with Japan. But Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin also announced that a conference of the United Nations would open in San Francisco on April 25 of that year. Having directed the United States' massive war effort, Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II or the creation of the international peacekeeping body. Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12, 1945. The war in Europe ended May 7. And during the closing days of World War II, the UN was chartered. The representatives of the Allied nations met as promised in San Francisco. On June 26, 1945, the governing treaty was signed by the delegates. On October 24, 1945, shortly after the war ended with Japan, the United Nations officially came into existence when the required number of nations approved the charter. 50 nations were members of the UN at the outset. Today the membership numbers 191.
What was the Niagara Movement?
It was a short-lived but important African-American organization that advocated the total integration of blacks into mainstream society, with all the rights, privileges, and benefits of other Americans. Founded in Niagara Falls, Ontario, in 1905, the Niagara Movement was led by writer, scholar, and activist W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, who was then a professor of economics and history at Atlanta University. Observers described the organization as the anti-Bookerite camp. Educator Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1915, who rose from slavery to found Alabama's Tuskegee Institute. 1881, believed change for black people should be effected through education and self-improvement, not through demand. Mr. Washington opposed the social and political agitation favored by some reformers. The Niagara Movement, on the other hand, placed the responsibility for the nation's racial problems squarely on the shoulders of its white population. The 30 branches of the Niagara Movement challenged conservative politics of the so-called Tuskegee machine led by Booker T. Washington. Though the Niagara organization dissolved in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was heir to its ideology and activism. Dubois helped found that organization, and from 1910 to 1934 edited its official journal, The Crisis, in which he published his views on nearly every important social issue that confronted the black community.
Who was Cesar Chavez?
Mexican-American farm worker Cesar Chavez, 1927 to 1993. Was a labor union organizer and spokesperson of the poor. Born in Arizona, his family lost their farm when he was just 10 years old. They became migrant workers in California, where farm production, particularly of grape crops, depended on the temporary laborers. Chavez knew the migrant workers' life intimately, and as a young man he began working to improve conditions for his people. In 1962 he organized California grape pickers into the National Farm Workers Association. 4 years later this union merged with another to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, or UFWOC. The name was changed to the United Farm Workers of America, or UFW, in 1973. An impassioned speaker known for squishing bunches of grapes in his hands as he delivered his messages, Chavez went on to lead a nationwide boycott of table grapes, since growers had refused to accept the collective bargaining of the UFWOC. By the close of the 1970s, California growers of all crops had accepted the Migrant Workers Union, now called the United Farm Workers. Like Martin Luther King Jr., Chavez maintained that nonviolent protest was the key to achieving change.
What is philosophy?
From the Greek philo, meaning love of, and Sophia, meaning wisdom, philosophy is literally a love of wisdom. In practice, it is the pursuit of understanding the human condition, how, why, and what it means to exist or to be. Philosophers use methods such as observation and questioning to discern the truth. Philosophy is traditionally divided between Eastern thought and Western thought. Further, Western thought consists of 5 branches: metaphysics, concerned with the nature of the universe or of reality; logic, the laws of reasoning; epistemology, the nature of knowledge and the process by which knowledge is gained; ethics, the moral values or rules that influence human conduct; and aesthetics, the nature of beauty or the criteria for art.
How long have people been getting sick?
Humankind has suffered from illnesses since humans first appeared on Earth millions of years ago. But in the absence of medical knowledge, which only began about 5,000 years ago, ailments and sickness were assumed to have been brought on by angered gods or evil spirits. Even today, some primitive groups believe they must appease the gods and Spirits threw offerings and sacrifices in order to stave off or rid themselves of illness. These are practices carried out by witch doctors or healers. In prehistoric times, such superstitious beliefs resulted in the first medical procedure, in which a hole was drilled into the patient's skull. This practice was believed to allow evil spirits to escape the body and thereby rid the body of sickness. Fossil findings showing this method of treatment date back about 10,000 years. One vestige of ancient treatments of illness that still has relevance today is the use of plants and plant substances for medicinal purposes.
What was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal?
News of the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, where Iraqi prisoners were being held by members of the U.S. military during Operation Iraqi Freedom, first surfaced in April 2004 when shocking photographs began appearing in the American media. The photos depicted an array of hideous abuses, all of them in violation of the Geneva Conventions for the treatment of prisoners of war. The deep troubles first surfaced in spring 2003 when International Red Cross and human rights groups complained that American troops had been mistreating Iraqi prisoners. The U.S. Army launched an investigation into its prison system. A fact-finding mission was eventually led by Major General Antonio Taguba, who completed his report in February 2004. It stated that one police company at Abu Ghraib had committed sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. The Taguba report also found that supervisory omission was rampant at the prison. More investigations and reports followed, taking into account other prisons under central command. Some of the reports tied prisoner deaths to the abuses. The scandal sent shockwaves around the world and sparked an intense debate about how such abuses could have happened. The tortures were labeled by some as unauthorized actions taken by a few individuals, but others believed they were a manifestation of policy that had gone wrong. The scandal soon widened. By May 2004, British newspapers began reporting abuses by British troops, while Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, apologized for any mistreatment Iraqi prisoners may have suffered at the hands of British troops. President Bush went on Arabic television to denounce the abuses as abhorrent. He stopped short of an apology, saying that the mistreatment does not represent the America that I know. Both nations moved quickly to bring charges against several soldiers shown in the pictures. The guilty verdicts, and subsequent sentences, began being handed down in May 2004. The prison scandals fueled criticism of the controversial war in Iraq. They also prompted a deadly backlash from the Arab world. Insurgents in Iraq began a series of kidnappings of Americans and British citizens working in Iraq, most of them ending in ghastly and widely publicized killings. Between spring 2004 and spring 2005, more than 200 foreigners were taken captive in Iraq. More than 30 of them were killed by their kidnappers.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit two object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
Why did people first believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah?
In his lifetime, Jesus of Nazareth, c. 6b.cc AD 30, was believed to be the Messiah for many reasons. These reasons are explained in detail in the New Testament, particularly in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. First, Jesus was thought to have been miraculously conceived by Mary, a virgin. In Luke 2:8-20, an angel is described as having spoken to shepherds tending their fields, telling them that in this night in the city of David, a Savior is born unto you, a Messiah, the Lord. And goes on to say that the sign of the Messiah is that they will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes. Also in Luke 2:36-38, a prophetess arrives and proclaims Mary's baby to be the child to all who were looking for the liberation of the Jews. Further, Jesus proclaimed himself to be the Son of God, as described, for example, in John 5:17-23. He demonstrated extraordinary healing powers, used parables to teach moral and spiritual ways, and carried a message of God's redeeming love. All of this was convincing enough that many, mostly the common people, became disciples or followers of Christ during his lifetime.
Who invented the skyscraper?
The credit is usually given to American architect William Jenney, 1832-1907, who designed the 10-story home insurance building, erected on the corner of LaSalle and Monroe Streets in Chicago in 1885. The building was the first in which the entire structure was of skeleton construction of cast iron, wrought iron, and Bessemer steel. However, some experts believe the first skyscraper to have been designed was one by the American firm Halliburton and Roche, also in Chicago. The firm, founded by two former students of Jenney, designed the skeleton frame Tacoma building, which was actually not completed until 1889. Both the home insurance building and the Tacoma building were demolished in 1931 and 1929, respectively. It was the use of steel, the innovation of a safe elevator, and the use of central heating that combined to make possible the construction of tall buildings toward the end of the 19th century. Once the trend had started, it quickly took off. Another Chicago firm, Burnham and Root, Burnham, too, had been a student of Jenney, completed the 14-story Reliance building in 1895, it had a steel skeleton frame. The further development of the skyscraper is visible in the gauge buildings in Chicago, two of which were designed by Holabert and Roche, and one by Lewis Henry Sullivan. 1856 to 1924, the Chicago architect often credited for mastering the skyscraper. Other Chicago skyscrapers built by Holabert and Roche during the early days of modern architecture include the Marquette Building, 1894, and the Tribune Building, 1901.
How does the Catholic Church determine who will be Pope?
Present-day procedures for electing a pope who serves the Church until his death vary from those of earlier times. Before the 300s, the clergy of Rome and the outlying areas cast votes in what was essentially a local papal election. Throughout history, some of Europe's powerful rulers tried to influence the outcome of papal elections in order to establish a pope who would be favorable to their leadership. This interference in the process sometimes resulted in disputes over who was the rightful pope, with more than one pope claiming authority based on the support of emperors or factions within the Church. Those claiming to be popes but who were considered illegitimate are called anti-popes. The process observed by the Roman Catholic Church today was established over time. The first important decision came in 1059 when Pope Nicholas II, c. 980-1061, declared that papal electors must be cardinals. In 1179 the Third Lateran Council established that all cardinals have an equal vote and that popes may only be elected by a two-thirds majority. This came after Pope Alexander III, c. 1105 to 1181, had been opposed by three anti-popes. Pope Gregory X, 1210 to 1276, after being elected to the papacy following a 3-year vacancy, assembled the Council of Lyon in 1274, which decreed that the cardinals must meet within 10 days of a pope's death to determine the papacy. Further, the council required that the cardinals remain together in strict seclusion until they have elected a new pope. Today, when a pope dies, the dean of the Sacred College notifies all cardinals of the vacancy. The cardinals convene at Vatican City in a meeting that is required to begin within 20 days of the pope's death. Any of 3 electoral processes may be used: ballot, which is most common, unanimous voice vote, or the unanimous decision of a committee of 9 to 15 delegates. 4 votes are taken a day, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, until there is a two-thirds majority vote. As soon as a decision is reached, the dean asks the pope-elect if he accepts the position. Once he accepts, he is considered pope and has full authority over the Church. He then proceeds to select a name, which he announces to the cardinals. Following these private meetings, the results of which are eagerly awaited by devout Roman Catholics, white smoke is sent up a chimney of the Vatican Palace, signaling to the crowd in St. Peter's Square that the election is complete. The smoke is created by burning ballots from elections in which a 2/3 majority was not achieved are also burned, but in a way that creates black smoke. In this way, the public is apprised of the cardinal's decision-making process. The oldest cardinal has the honor of making the official announcement to the people in St. Peter's Square. Then the people are blessed by the new pope in his first official act. The coronation of the pope is held later.
When was the Interstate Commerce Commission formed?
The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, was established by Act of Congress in 1887. The agency is responsible for regulating the rates and services of specified carriers that transport freight, goods, whether raw or finished, and passengers between states. Its jurisdiction, expanded by subsequent acts of Congress, includes trucking, bus services, water carriers, expedited delivery services, and even oil pipelines. The regulatory agency, the nation's first such body, was born out of necessity in the late 1800s. As farmers in particular charged the railroads with discriminatory freight practices, with rail lines crisscrossing the nation. The question of who would control rates and monitor practices had become an increasingly difficult one to answer. Many states, particularly in the Midwest, set up their own regulatory boards. But because the rail companies operated between states, enforcing state laws on them proved cumbersome and impractical. Meanwhile, the railroads, operating without the purview of any effective regulatory body, set their own standards and practices, which resulted in many abuses. In an 1877 U.S. Supreme Court ruling, in the case of Munn v. Illinois, the authority of the state boards to regulate the railroads was upheld. But less than a decade later, in the case of Wabash, St. Louis and Pacific Railway Company v. Illinois, the High Court invalidated its earlier decision and proclaimed that only the U.S. Congress has the right to regulate interstate commerce. Citing Section 8 of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, 1790, which states that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. And among the several states, and with the Indian tribes, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed in 1887. Setting up the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the interstate railroads. The agency's purview was later expanded to include all ground and water carriers that operate on an interstate basis. In addition to controlling rates, the agency also enforces laws against discrimination. The ICC's authority was strengthened by congressional legislation including the Hepburn Act, 1906, and the Mann-Elkins Act, 1910.
Did the Cold War ever get hot?
After World War II, 1939–45, an intense rivalry developed between so-called Eastern Bloc countries, made up of the Communist Soviet Union and its allies, and the Western Bloc countries, the United States and its democratic allies. Though mutual suspicion, distrust, and fear ran deep on both sides of the conflict, the Cold War, 1947–89, never resulted in fighting, it never became hot. But both sides nevertheless prepared for that possibility by strengthening military alliances and developing and stockpiling weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, was probably the closest the Cold War came to getting hot.
Why was the Titanic thought to be unsinkable?
The RMS Titanic was state-of-the-art, a huge and luxurious ocean liner equipped with the latest and best. The ship's size afforded it great stability, its structure included more steel than had been used in previous ships. It was built with a double bottom, both skins were heavier and thicker than those of other ships. The hull was divided by 15 bulkheads, upright partitions, that rose 5 decks forward and aft, back, and 4 decks midship. These transverse bulkheads divided the ship into 16 compartments watertight. Chambers, any 2 of which could take on water without sinking the ship. This marvel of modern technology, which was to be the jewel in the crown of the White Star Line, was given a fitting name. Titanic is a Greek word meaning having great force or power, and it was described as practically unsinkable. However, the ship designer did not and could not prepare the ship for what happened on the night of April 14, 1912. Just before midnight, the Titanic was speeding at 21 knots through the North Atlantic. Even though the crew had been warned by other ships that the unusually calm waters were full of ice. When the Titanic's 2 watchmen, who were not using binoculars, sighted an iceberg in the ship's path, it was only a quarter-mile away. The ship was turned to the port, left, but it was too late. The underwater shelf of the ice tore through the plating on the starboard, right, side of the ship. Thin slits developed at the seams in the ship's hull, allowing seawater to enter. The effect was similar to filling an ice tray with water, once one watertight chamber had filled. The rushing water spilled over the top and into the next. Titanic came to symbolize human arrogance. The ship owners and operators believed the Titanic was impervious to nature. Consequently, the ocean liner had not been equipped with the number of lifeboats needed to rescue everyone on board. Titanic's lifeboats had room for about half the passengers. Since there had been no safety drills on board, many lifeboats were launched only half full. The enormous loss of life, which included society's most prominent individuals as well as ordinary families who were immigrating to America, stands out as one of the great tragedies in the history of transportation.
Who are the members of the United Nations Security Council?
According to the UN Charter, the Security Council has 15 members. 5 permanent and 10 that are elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms. The permanent members are China, France, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The 10 temporary slots are elected annually, 5 nations at a time. So that on January 1, 2004, the following nations began 2-year memberships: Algeria, Benin, Brazil, the Philippines, and Romania. On January 1, 2005, Argentina, Denmark, Greece, Japan, and the United Republic of Tanzania began 2-year memberships. In 2005, Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil made bids for permanent seats on the Council.
What was the Great Awakening?
The Great Awakening was an American religious movement that began in New England in the mid-1730s. At its center were the fire and brimstone sermons delivered by charismatic preachers such as Congregational minister Jonathan Edwards, 1703–1758, and Anglican missionary George Whitefield, 1714–1770. Revivals were another cornerstone of the movement. These were evangelistic meetings that moved around the countryside. From Maine to Georgia, converting, or awakening people to Christianity not through the doctrines of the church, but rather through the individual's own experience. The theology of the Great Awakening was Calvinist, stressing the depravity of man and the sovereignty of God, and promoting the belief that faith, and not conduct, is the road to salvation. In its emphasis on the individual and its espousal that the individual is the final arbiter of truth, the movement had a profound effect on the spiritual and political character of what would soon become the United States. Since many vehemently opposed the movement, it also served to divide churches between the revivalists and the traditionalists. Thus, it diversified American religious life and promoted religious tolerance.
Were the Vikings the first Europeans to reach North America?
It is believed that the seafaring Norsemen, who are alternately called the Vikings, were in fact the first Europeans to see the Western Hemisphere, North and South America and the surrounding waters. Norwegian-born Leif Erikson, c. 970–c. 1020, is generally credited with having been the first European to set foot on North American soil. Erikson was the son of navigator Eric the Red, who founded a Norse settlement in Greenland and moved his family there in 985 or 986. About that same time another Norseman, Bjarni Herjolfsson, who was driven off course on his way from Iceland to Greenland, became the first European to sight North America, but he did not go ashore. It is believed that Ericsson decided he would follow up on Herjolfsson's discovery. About 1001 Ericsson set out from Greenland with a crew of 35 men and probably landed on the southern end of Baffin Island, due north of the province of Quebec. The expedition likely made it to Labrador, Newfoundland, on the northeastern North American mainland, and later landed on the coast of what is today Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, Canada. This landfall may have been at Lance Auxiliary Meadows, on Newfoundland Island. Ericsson and his crew spent the winter of 1001-02 at a place he called Vinland, which was described as well wooded and produced fruit, especially grapes. He returned to Greenland in the spring of 1002. The first authenticated European landing in North America was in 1500 when Portuguese navigator Gaspar de Corte Real c. 1450 c. 1501, explored the coast of Labrador and Newfoundland. A year later, he made a second trip to North America but never returned home. In 1502 his brother Miguel went out in search of him, neither returned.
What is the Hegelian dialectic?
It is the system of reasoning put forth by German philosopher George Hegel, 1770-1831, who theorized that at the center of the universe there is an absolute spirit that guides all reality. According to Hegel, all historical developments follow three basic laws: each event follows a necessary course. In other words, it could not have happened in any other way. Each historical event represents not only change but progress, and one historical event, or phase, tends to be replaced by its opposite, which is later replaced by a resolution of the two extremes. This third law of Hegel's dialectic is the pendulum theory discussed by scholars and students of history. That events swing from one extreme to the other before the pendulum comes to rest at middle. The extreme phases are called the thesis and the antithesis, the resolution is called the synthesis. Based on this system, Hegel asserted that human beings can comprehend the unfolding of history. In this way, he viewed the human experience as absolute and knowable.
What were the Articles of Confederation?
This American document was the forerunner to the U.S. Constitution, 1788. Drafted by the Continental Congress at York, Pennsylvania. On November 15, 1777, the Articles of Confederation went into effect on March 1, 1781, when the last state, Maryland, ratified them. The Articles had shortcomings that were later corrected by the Constitution. They provided the states with more power than the central government, stipulating that Congress rely on the states both to collect taxes and to carry out the acts of Congress. It is largely thanks to Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, that the Articles were thrown out. Realizing they made for a weak national government, Hamilton led the charge to strengthen the central government even at the expense of the states. Eventually, he won the backing of George Washington, 1732 to 1799, James Madison, 1751 to 1836, John Jay, 1745 to 1829, and others, which led to the convening of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, where the ineffectual Articles of Confederation were thrown out and the Constitution was drafted. One lasting provision of the Articles of Confederation was the Ordinance of 1787, signed in an era of westward expansion. The ordinance set the guidelines for how a territory could become a state. A legislature would be elected as soon as the population had reached 5,000 voting citizens, which were men only. And the territory would be eligible for statehood once its population had reached 60,000.